Hey guys, Joe Simons here. Before we get into this episode, I need your help with one thing, and that is to go pick your 11 lures for 1 penny. Yes, we are doing an 11 lures, so that means you get to go pick any of our lures, 11 total, for just 1 penny over at 11lures.com. We are doing this because what we found is that every time we give lures out as samples, people keep coming back and buying more of them over and over and over again. So this is our way of putting our best foot forward to get some amazing lures that we know work for redfish and speckled trout and snook and flounder in your hands so that you will come back and buy more. It is first come, first serve over at 11lures.com. That's 11lures.com. So the number 11lures.com. See you over there and enjoy the episode.
In my soul. Welcome to the Salt Strong Podcast, disrupting fishing entertainment as you know it. Prepare to laugh. Prepare to get to know fishing legends in a whole new and unfiltered way. And on occasion, you might even learn a thing or two about fishing. Here's your host, Joe Simons. Like diamonds.
Hello, Salt Strong Nation. Joe Simons, like diamonds, back again, talking about where have all the trout gone. Reminds me of one of Justin's favorite songs by Paula Cole, Where Have All the Cowboys Gone? So we're here talking about trout. You know, we had our insider meetup here recently, and a lot of people are having trouble catching trout. Now, that was maybe a little bit related to this massive Piney Point spill and all the red tide and stuff that we had to deal with. But in general, in the winter, people love catching trout. And so if you're having trouble or just not catching as many as you want, this is a podcast for you. So we got Luke, Richard, Wyatt, Justin. We got kind of a lot of different areas covered here, from up there in Jacksonville, St. Augustine, all the way over to Texas. So who wants to kick this off? Just a kind of a general idea of where trout go in the wintertime and why aren't we catching as many as we want to when we're going to our old summer and fall spots.
Yeah, I'll start off with just from fishing with like CA we did a trout course a while back and doing the trout course with Peter Deeks when I interviewed him on his section. The one thing that I think helps the most on identifying trout and on some good trout feeding grounds is deep water. They really a lot of the summertime flats where there's a lot of big trout up in the shallow water aren't as good as in the wintertime. That was my biggest problem when I would try to go winter fishing. I thought that wintertime was terrible because I was going to my normal summertime spots, and it's rare that a spot is good all year long. And so what I look for now is just some depth, like at least 5 feet of water, ideally more, that actually has some structure of some sort and at least a little bit of current flow. And even staying near, redfish and snook will go further in, and trout seem to kind of hang in the general area. But they'll just kind of shift towards the deeper water. But the good news, they're tougher to find. But the good news is once you find them, you can catch a ton. So it's a kind of a pro con. But for that last reason, though, once you do find them, it's amazing. And so now, like wintertime is one of my favorite times to fish.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think the biggest thing, like you said, Luke, is deep water proximity to like some shallow hunting grounds. A really good question we had at that meetup actually was, if we're fishing in the winter and we get a warming trend, what do fish do? So you do have your textbook type of spot for winter trout fishing, which is that deeper water, those drop-offs that have structure on them, things like that. But, you get those warming trends that come in and throw everything off, and folks can get a little bit confused as to where they need to find fish. But to consistently stay on them, I think the best spots are those areas where you do have that deep water, you have that structure, but there's shallow water hunting opportunities nearby, preferably areas that have seagrass. Now, some areas like the marshes don't have seagrass, Jacksonville all the way through the Carolinas. Seagrass is not a common thing, and we'll go into, some marsh areas here in a second. But the overall theme is that those fish will hang in those, intercoastal channels, on points and things like that, where there's rocks or something for them to feed on mid-column before it really starts to drop off. And they'll use those shallow water hunting opportunities nearby during the warm days. So if you have one of those warming days where those fish aren't following the cold trends, know that it's because they want to feed shallow because it's a little bit easier for them. So there's a lot of factors that can go into fish not necessarily following the rules, but they're going to have something that you can key in on, and just really being aware of the conditions is something I would say that I see a lot of people not do in the wintertime, is taking into what the weather has been doing and what it's doing the day that you are fishing.
Cool. Justin and Richard, you guys, Justin, I know you got a slam during our little 4-hour tournament. Richard, you caught a ton of trout. What were you guys doing? Where were you finding them?
I was copying Richard.
Okay. Richard, what were you doing?
So, I mean, I think, Justin, every time we got into some trout, there were really, two main things present. And the first is going to be deeper water. Every single trout we caught was in either proximity to or in that deeper water. And the other thing was structure, and then some current flow. And especially some areas like where I'm at too, if you can find a soft spot, this is why structure is so important in that current flow. I mean, that's kind of a, textbook, area for success, especially during the winter. So like these big, oyster rakes, or I did really, really well last week. There was a small island and there was trees coming out and pushing out underwater. It was reds, trout, and flounder. They were all there kind of in that soft spot around that structure, but right next to deeper water. So that is literally the keys to success right now.
All right. So when you guys keep saying deeper water, what does that mean to you?
That's so variable.
Yeah.
I got to take this from you. Like, this conversation is tough, and we'll try to simplify it, but the types of areas that sea trout, whether you're fishing, areas where there's structure and the topography, if you will, of what Texas is like, is different from central Tampa Bay, is different from Northeast Florida. And even though they're all sea trout, they tend to behave differently based on the type of layout that the fishery is. So when we say deeper water, at least for areas where you're otherwise fishing, 2 to 3 feet or less most of the year for redfish and trout, with the exception of winter, we keep referencing deep water. I'd say in those times where you're normally fishing for fish shallow, you want things that are deeper than that, or any sort of deep gradient. Now, to put like a number to it can be tough. Luke said 5 feet, 6 feet. I think that's pretty good. I think anywhere between 4-6 feet is a good range, considering we spend a lot of our time fishing about that 2-foot depth most of the year. So where we found trout was, we fished 5 or 6 different types of areas, Richard, in one day. We had channels, we had shallow grass flats, we had shallow mud flats, we had a creek system with sloping mud. We had a hole at the end of a creek, and that's kind of where they were stacked, is that whole creek system is deeper in general than the 2-foot flats. The channel was pretty deep. It was 4 or 5 feet, but we couldn't buy a trout. I mean, there really wasn't anything unique about it. So you adding structure was integral into that, because it isn't just about deep water. It's deep water with an ambush point, with something that these fish are going to orient themselves to. So you said kind of a soft bottom mud. I think the fact that it's different, you're looking for not just deep water, but why this deep water? Because you could fish a whole channel and they could sporadically be throughout the channel, but they're going to be at that channel where it curves in. Oh yeah, booyah. That point right there where the water is swooping around with the wind adds another layer to why they chose that deep section.
It's good.
I guess I'll chime in on the depth thing. Like Justin said, it's really dependent on the region that you're in. I think the average grass flat range for catching sea trout is, consistently 2 to 4 feet. Would you guys agree with that? 2 to 4 feet average. But what I'm seeing in the wintertime is those trout will hang near those 2, 3, 4 foot grass flats, and they'll drop off to 5 and 6 feet near the intercoastal channels where it starts to get deeper, but they're feeding in that 5, 6, 7 foot range. They feed upwards. They want to be up in the shallow flats because there's less area for bait to be able to run away from them. If they've got more water column above their head, it's easier for that bait to get away, but they need to have that stable temperature of deeper water. So those edges of those flats that drop off to, 5, 7 feet, those are where I'm going. But if I'm fishing in a marsh, it could be a little bit different. Those cuts in between those channels where they hold on the points. I've had points that I've fished that are, 10 feet deep, and I'm jigging a paddle tail down with a 1/4 ounce all the way towards the bottom and bouncing off the bottom up. So it's really dependent on your region. Those areas further north get a lot colder, so you'll find those fish holding in deeper water that's, again, a little bit more stable. So you might be going, double the depth that I am in the grass flats. Know that if you're in warmer areas, generally they can hold a little bit shallower. So it's very region specific, but generally further north I go, the deeper I'm having to fish in the wintertime.
And I'll throw another angle to it too. It also depends as far as the depth. It's all relative, right? Relative to other areas, like other surrounding areas that the trout can actually get to relatively fast. But also the actual temperature swing is a big factor. Did it really just go down like 5 degrees or 10 degrees? And basically, the bigger the temperature swing downward, right, as a big cold front comes in and the temperatures like we just had, like really, really went down, that's when they're going to go to the deepest water possible that they can get into. Like Justin mentioned, that channel was deeper than the flat, but that hole was deeper than everything. And that hole is where most of the fish were. I kind of stumbled into that a few years back. I was fishing a tournament in Newport Richey. One of our members, Gene Hammond, organized it. I'd never fished there before, and I couldn't bring my boat. I didn't have time. I was on the flight the next morning, so I brought the paddleboard. It was terrible weather. Really extreme cold front came in. I was literally about to quit because all the shallows that I looked on the Google Maps, there was no fish on there. And then my last ditch effort, I literally just tied myself to the rocks of the channel, and like there were literally boats going right by. I was fishing the main channel. It was about 10 feet of water, and I was bouncing a shrimp down the bottom, and I started hammering trout. I actually won the trout division in the area I'd never been to before, just because I just went, okay, let me just try the deepest water possible. And it happened to, like, some of the biggest trout I caught like 10 feet behind a boat. The boat just go by, I'd cast behind it, and they were sitting right under the boat traffic, because that was the warmest water, right? The surface area had the most air to surface touch points. So the top part got really cold. The bottom was warm, and those trout were just holding right down there, even though boats were running right over them.
Yeah. Do you mind explaining that real quick? Because I think there's probably some newer anglers who are asking themselves, all right, why are they going down to the deepest part in the winter? Do you mind explaining that, of what happens with that top layer and vice versa? As the sun comes up, in muddy areas, it could actually warm that area up in that water. Explain that real quick.
Yeah, it's an important thing, and I'm sure all of us have missed it for many years. I did for like 10 plus years, but basically overnight is what, obviously, a cold front comes in overnight. That cold air is what's impacting the water, right? And so the most surface to water, surface air there is, the more that cold air is going to translate into the water. And the shallower the water is, that the colder the water is going to be. And so, and the deeper stuff, that cold air is impacting, say, the top 3-4 feet of water, depending on how long it's been cold and how far the drop was. But that lower level of water is going to be warmer, right? It still might be colder than what the trout really prefer, but it's much warmer than anywhere else. So they're going right down to the bottom of that deepest hole. And but then when it warms, right? So like, say, in the afternoon, after the sun's been up all day long, now the sun is warming that top layer, and especially up in the shallows, it's warming the top layer and the bottom. It's actually impacting the bottom, which is helping to warm. That's when those fish will actually move from the deep water, and they'll move up shallow, and that's when some really cool sight fishing chances happen. But that's why you really have to factor in the actual relative temperature, and like what everybody was saying before, it's all spot on. Like, to find deep water that's near structure, but also, like what Wyatt said, also has some shallow water nearby, because that way they can get the best of both worlds. As soon as it warms up, they shoot up in the shallows, they have structure they can feed, and then when it gets cold, they can just go right down there in the deep stuff and have shelter from the cold.
And to add to that, that difference of temperature isn't going to be that much. It could be like point something degree difference. I mean, it could be like 66.9 on the flats, and it could be 60 or 67.5.
I was told there's going to be no math today.
Yeah, no, I have to. But like, you got to mention, what's a thermocline? Like, a thermocline is where that warmer water is down at the bottom, because the top water section is a little bit cooler. Thermoclines happen in that like 30 foot range, which is much deeper than what we're talking about. But that thermocline temperature difference could be like 4 or 5 degrees different. It could be way higher. For shallower stuff, if we're talking within 10 feet and less, there is still a gradient difference. The only time that wouldn't apply is if you have a cold front and like it's so rough that it's turning over the bottom and the top of the water to where they're all the same temperature. And then it's kind of like, man, why would they go out deep? Well, they're probably in a catatonic state. They're probably not feeding, and it's tough under those conditions. But general cold swings, Luke is right. Even if it's 6 to 10 feet, there's going to be that little temperature break. And they'll hang out there until that water temperature gets higher with higher sun and muddy bottom, as you covered. I think it changes when you get into the deeper stuff. For those guys like fishing Virginia, if you've got 20 feet plus, you're going for trout. There's a thermocline aspect to that, but for a lot of people here in the Southeast, for the most part, there's going to be a difference, but it's a small variable difference, you know.
Good. So let's talk about how to fish these areas, right? So if we all agree in the winter, you know, these trout, they're not moving too far, to your point, Wyatt, right? They're not like moving in a whole new state. They're not crossing state lines, but they're trying to stay where they always know there's food. But they're also trying to find an area that has a deeper hole, ledge, some area to attack the same kind of bait fish that might be nearby. And when it warms up, they have an easy route to get there. How do you guys fish it differently? Are we slowing down? Are we changing certain types of lures? Are you letting it just sit there? You covering it with Dr. Juice? Or is it all the above? What are you guys doing?
So I'd say probably the first thing that I'm going to do, and this does touch back a little bit on spots, is find an oyster bar. Reason for that is oyster bars warm up before everything else. That shell and like sand and mud and everything, you know, the darker that bottom content is, the faster it's going to warm up. Mud typically warms up fastest out of all just your natural bottom, but when it comes to shell, it's of dark color and it holds heat better than just the mud itself. So first I look for an oyster bar. Now we know we can't fish on the bottoms of those oyster bars. We're gonna get snagged up, and trout typically feed facing up. So like if you swim something over their head, they attack from below. They're ambush predators. So knowing they're typically going to hold close to an oyster bar, I'm going to find a point that's got an oyster bar on it. Trout love current. So you've got that current box checked off. You've got the structure box checked off with the oysters. And then you need the presentation. So we're going to be looking to swim something or jig something mid-column typically to get those fish in the optimal opportunity for them to strike, because they feed upwards. So we're not going to be fishing too close to the bottom with like a shrimp jig or something like that. Or if we are, we need to make sure we're popping it really hard up and we're not letting it get all the way to the bottom. This is when our paddle tails or suspending twitch baits really shine in the wintertime. I do like the mirror lures. They're not a great search bait, and if you find the fish, they can be really effective, but usually my go-to is going to be a paddle tail that I'm doing a twitch pause with. An example of everything we've just talked about put together, I've been fishing the edge of these flats down in Baffin Bay, where there is worm rocks. They're kind of like oysters. They do the same thing. They warm up fast. And I'm fishing my lure down current of those worm rocks, retrieving over them, twitch pause, letting it settle back down past those worm rocks. Those trout are positioned downward of those warmer bars or those warmer rocks, where that warm water is just moving down current. They're sitting in the warm area waiting for an easy meal. That structure attracts bait, and then just twitch pause over that area. They come and they just hammer that lure. With the suspending twitch bait, it'd be something similar, just knowing that it's not going to have a constant swimming action. I'm not going to be able to cover as much ground. So if I've got a spread of rocks or oysters in front of me, I can't feel out all of those rocks and oysters as fast. Now, if I find them really thick with the paddle tail on one set of rocks or one bar, then I might pull out my suspending twitch bait and really start laying into them. But I usually start with the paddle tail right off the bat.
Well, so I mean, earlier we talked a lot about finding the deeper areas. Then you said find the oyster bar. I want to close that in and tie it all together. So we all agreed that finding deeper water, it's relative, but where does that tie into an oyster bar? So you're trying to find an oyster bar that has a deep ledge next to it. I just want to make sure we're not confusing people.
Yeah. So the oyster bars, typically you're going to find them right on the drop-off, so right where that edge is, because oyster bars grow in current. So if you've got, the edge of a flat, there's typically a lot of current over there, or a point somewhere where we say deeper water. In Richard's area, you've got bends and creeks, right? So usually on the point of that bend in a creek, if you're fishing that deep hole, you're going to have a lot of oysters that line that point, and trout will sit on the down current sides of those areas. So you've got the deep hole in close proximity to the structure that's warm. So you've got pretty much everything you need right there. Oysters are almost always going to be found next to a depth change. Not always, but usually, like I said, you're going to find them on the edges of flats. You're going to find them on points, in creek bends. And those are all areas where you've got deep water, like within 20 yards.
Cool. It's good. Thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah.
What you want just for like the Tampa Bay area, there's not a whole lot of oysters, and when there are, they're a lot of times they're way up on the flat, and if there's a situation where it's near the deep water, that is like a primo spot. That's like a tough one. Otherwise, they just go to like the outside edges of grass flats. So just kind of replace oysters with seagrass, and then if they're if like a significant cold front just comes through, then sometimes you have to get right in their face. You almost have to bounce in their mouth. But that's why it said, like, bouncing, like, don't drag on the bottom, bounce it along the bottom, and they'll just instinctively, if they have a lure, bounce up like 10 inches and start falling near their head, they're going to eat it. Like they're obviously, they might not be hungry, but just their instinct will just say, hey, there's an easy meal. I can just literally do one kick of the tail and eat it. Like they're going to eat it. So it's just going slow, like going super slow, and just try to get right in their face. And knowing that's really the only way to make it happen. They're not going to come up and hit topwater lure. So get down there low. With oysters, you can't get too low because you're going to get snagged. So I always just kind of go on the deepest stuff and just bounce down the bottom.
I have one rule of thumb for anything I do in the wintertime, and it especially applies to trout, is I downsize the profile of my lure. Like I go down to some pretty small stuff. 3 inches tends to be my go-to plastic, but even from there, you guys lead off with a paddle tail, and I think I've mentioned in another video, like that's the most universal tool. I mean, you can swim it, you can jig it, you can bounce it, you can whatever with it, but sometimes I have a hard time getting a bite on a paddle tail in colder water areas or deep water areas if I'm fishing for trout. Richard, you got a couple on the Slam Shady 2.0. I mean, you were the trout master, so like you can speak to all that. I ended up slowing down and doing something without a paddle tail or a boot tail on the back of it, because sometimes that might be unwanted or unnecessary action on your lure. Sometimes if these fish are lethargic and they're not wanting to chase a bait fish, booting around, they might be a little more willing to target something with like a shrimp presentation. So I was throwing the Z-Man EZ shrimp, and I'll throw that. I'll throw like a little jerk shad. I'll throw like a mirror lure, Little John, something real small and finesse and just kind of darting and bouncing close to the bottom. I sometimes have more success with that type of presentation. So if you do go into these areas, I think it's good to have a variety of different lures to throw. Let's say 2, like start with a paddle tail, of course, on one setup. And if you look and you find an area that says, man, this looks productive, it's got some wind protection, it's a slope around a deeper area, there's an oyster bar or like a fallen tree, or I'm near a spoil island, and you got a good feeling that there's trout there, you could bounce it with a paddle tail. And if you're not getting bit, try something without a paddle tail. Try bouncing bottom that doesn't have that same type of vibration and action, and that may end up being the thing to get a bite. There have been times where that's worked out for me, and sometimes where a paddle tail is all that I needed. But you'll be surprised, just a slight change in your lure, whether it's profile, downsizing, or taking away that vibration aspect and having it just kind of be this little thing darting around on bottom, more imitates a shrimp or more imitates a really, really tiny bait fish, because that's really what's around more in the wintertime. We're not finding the big, pinfish and mullet like we do throughout the rest of the year.
Yeah, and some areas too, kind of up in my area, all the way up a little bit in the East Coast. We've got, like what Wyatt was talking about, you've got, your known places like your deep bends in the creeks, and you've got those oysters, and you've got those areas that have some softer spots in current. But 2 other areas that I really focus on as well are going to be, one is going to be like a transition zone. So if you've got a really good like mud flat or even a bay, but there's a channel right next to it, even here, when it starts to warm up, sometimes those trout may not completely commit in this area here, because we got big tidal swings. They may not completely commit to go on the flat necessarily, but they will be like right on the edge as soon as that drop off happens, because what is going on the flat is all that bait. So all they have to do is stay there, especially on an outgoing tide. And that's a really good ambush spot for them. And then the other one that's probably one of my favorites, and I absolutely kill it this time of year, and I don't see a whole lot of other people doing it, is dock fishing, especially around your lower tide periods. And I love targeting docks that have rocks and riprap and just, all kind of big kind of seawalls and stuff like that. And if you can find some that are kind of more on that north side, I mean, they're just getting hit by the sun all day. And I have had days where I haven't had to move because the trout are stacked up in those areas. So those are probably some of my favorite. But yeah, going back to what you were saying with the paddle tail, Justin, like that's spot on. And one of the things that I've been doing recently is, it's tough to get your lure down as deep as you need to at times. So what you kind of have to do is target your tide periods that, don't have as much current flow. So like, your lower and top thirds. But one thing that I've really noticed and started catching a lot more fish by doing is getting rid of that heavy jig head, those 1/4 ounce or anything more than that, because I can't tell you how many times I've done that and no bites. I know the fish are there. Then I'll switch up to like a 1/8 or a 1/16 of an ounce with this exact profile and just let it fall. I mean, you got to be patient. You got to throw that thing out there. You got to look at your watch, sip a drink, and then all of a sudden you can pop it. And a lot of times the fish have eaten it on that fall. But if you throw a 1/4 ounce down there, it's just moving too fast for them and they're being real finicky. So that's a really good tip. And then Justin, like what you said on the bottom, I'm either going super light, or if I do use a 1/4 ounce or something heavier, I'm probably not going to use a paddle tail. I'm probably going to use like a shrimp profile or jerk shad where I can just barely bump it on the bottom. And a lot of times that'll get some strikes too.
It's interesting because I think a lot of people here fish the deep spots, right? We're talking now 7, maybe 8, 10 feet. I'm automatically thinking, hey, I'm going to use a heavier jig head. And you're saying the opposite is these trout are still a little bit picky, finicky, not as hungry and on alert, perhaps. I don't know, or just don't like to see something coming down at their face that fast. So you're going down to a 1/8.
Yeah, I mean, I'm fishing in 8 to 12 feet of water with that jig head. And I mean, the only way to fish it, it's really difficult if you're throwing parallel, across current, because what will happen is, I know people on podcasts can't see it, but the way that the current comes, if your lure is, going cross current, it's going to take it. But if you can throw it, like what Wyatt said earlier, directly in that current from you, the jig head has a chance to go straight down, and you can keep a little bit of tension on your line, but they'll hit it on that fall. That's how you can get it deeper. And then, like I said, not going around mid tide, go around your top or your lower thirds, and the current flow is not going to be as much. And typically that's when they're feeding a little bit more in my area right now anyway, are going to be like on those lower tide periods. So that's kind of when is just as important as how right now, this time of year where I'm at.
This is way too good of a tip to not go deeper into, like talking about how to present your plastic, these softer, like lighter jig heads with current and depth. Like Joe, you're like, wait a second, if it's deeper, wouldn't you fish more effectively with a heavier weight to make contact with bottom faster? Yes, like sometimes that works. But you're right, Richard. It can be deadly on that slower descend of a plastic with a lighter jig head, but you need to compensate for current. So, and the biggest part of kind of what you're saying in summary is, if the current is going this way, okay, and you're trying to present that plastic on the conveyor belt with the current, you're not bringing the paddle tail or the soft plastic against the current. You're feeding it with the current so that it flows by the trout. So with a heavier jig head, you might only need to cast from here to here to effectively present to the bottom. With a lighter jig head, you might need to cast from here to here because you're compensating for that time on the descend. Because by the time it gets to here, you're in that strike zone and you can waft bottom with that lighter jig head. And sometimes that light weight on that descend can be the thing to get the hit. So applies to offshore fishing as well. So you're taking that concept, just shortening that depth range and slowing the descend. You're right. It requires patience. And I hear that, I'm like, man, that is so smart. Like, you could, in theory, present a soft plastic jerk shad like an Alabama leprechaun or the new Slam Shady jerk that we got that I really want to start playing around with more on a weedless weighted hook but you need to pitch it up against the current more so that it's got that time to sink down through the current. It's slower. It's probably more frustrating and more methodical, but man, it could be really deadly. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. I mean, I'm having to make sometimes, 70-foot casts, and then the last 20 feet right before the boat is when I get the bite,
Yeah.
It's crazy. Let's talk about the wind. You gave some really cool tips there, and that can include time of day. You're going early in the morning, late at night, middle of the day, right? And it's hottest at 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Certain tides. What do you guys think? Is there a better time of day or tide that you found that's worked best for winter trout?
Yeah, I would say in the wintertime, we're looking for a slight warming trend to get those fish fired up. That's, that is going to help us exponentially in getting those fish actively feeding where we can really reach them a little bit more. Because like Richard said, when they're locked down in those holes, you got to be really patient with them. For example, I'm going to be going out this evening once this podcast wraps up to go wade some flats because we've had a 30-degree temperature change from this morning. Early in the morning, it was in, upper 30, 39, and it's going to be up to almost, mid 60s. And I'm going to head out and try and get onto some fish that I know we're going to be sliding up away from those flat edges and maybe trying to pick off an easy meal before night sets in and we get another 30-degree night. So they're going to hunt up in the shallows when they can. I would say your best bet is not going to be right at sunrise when most people are accustomed to fishing. It might actually be mid-morning when those fish are looking to get their first meal, or late in the afternoon before the sun sets and it gets cold again. That first afternoon bite, once the sun really starts warming the water, is great. And then once it's been warm for a while, those fish that didn't commit to come up, a lot of times you'll see them sliding up as well. Some of the biggest trout that I've seen this winter so far have been when I'm going to go sight fish for reds at 1 and 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I'll be standing on my cooler and I'll look down. There's a 24-inch trout sitting in a foot of water. It's insane. It's cold outside. I'm wearing a jacket, but that water started to warm up the shallow areas that it will happen. So this is why it can be kind of tough to catch trout. They move around a lot in the winter, but it's really based on temperature. They're much more sensitive to temperature changes than redfish. But if you learn how they move in relation to that temperature and you factor in the warming trend, it's really easy to get onto those fish.
I agree with that. As far as the time of day, that's spot on. And to add the current flow into it as well, at least like in the Tampa Bay area, just like open bays where there's not a whole lot of current. I like to go during the max current time, just because that's going to be when the most food is getting moved around. And but then if fishing like an inlet, like Sebastian Inlet where I used to go, or in Richard's zone where there's a lot of just huge tidal swings, there's a point when there's just too much current to effectively fish it, where yes, they're probably still there and they're probably still feeding, but it's just really hard to get to them. So if you're in a situation that has a little bit of both, like maybe in the middle, the high current flow time frame, go into like a more open area where there's not just a ton of water constriction. And then when you get closer to the turns, then that's when I go to like a nearby pass or something where there's just a little bit more current flow, because they really like current, but there's also many times where there's just too much current to effectively fish. But right now I like the evenings. So I like right before dark, because twilights is always great. But the fact that the evening twilight has warmer water than the morning twilight, that's not my favorite time to go.
Yeah, and pretty similar for me. I mean, if I can find low water around the middle of the day and it's a sunny day, that's the day I want to go, because I mean, it's almost a 10-to-1 ratio on a outgoing tide here right now compared to an incoming. It's night and day difference, and you'll see it in my insider reports. But like, yeah, it's a tough week. It was incoming low starting, in the morning. The fish aren't, in the flats. They're in deeper water, and it takes a long time for them to kind of get ready to eat during that day. But those days or weeks even that have a little bit more of a warming trend and that lower waters in the middle of the day on that outgoing tide, they are really feeding well. I mean, it's crazy how much you can catch on those type of days, where compared to an incoming tide or a colder day or overcast day, they may just not feed or feed very little. So,
yeah. This time of the year, a lot of what we've shared has really just been for trout in general in different areas. right now, Wyatt, myself, all of us here, we want the big trout. We want the big gators. So if I could pick it right, Joe, and I wanted a recipe to go out and get like a 24, 25 inch or bigger, I'd want to time like an outgoing tide where that low tide happens early afternoon, like 1:00, 1:30. And my sweet zone to get out and get on some bigger trout would be near some potholes or like these access to deeper water areas with some structures, some bends in a canal, holes, what have you, where there is a shallower area and there's that window for these bigger gator trout to come up on that shallow edge and feed. If it's colder and we're on that warming trend with the sun getting higher, warming things up, and a lower water situation, they have this sweet window to get up and feed on something. And they might not be coming up and feeding on the surface and making it known, but they're going to move into that area where they've got a little bit of a warming trend, water levels moving out a little bit. They're going to be up against the edge of that shallow access point, and they're going to be willing to feed. So, I look for that when there isn't a lot of tidal flow in Mosquito Lagoon and Indian River. I'll go, and my best times of catching like 24, 25 inch or 27 inch trout historically have been between like 10:30 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon, where I can see them and they're laid up and they're a little more willing to eat versus right off the bat in the morning when it's pretty chilly out. I think you all agree, like, yeah, man, sometimes the bigger trout are going to hit later morning, early afternoon. If you want to time it with a tide, I'd say close to where it's going to bottom out at the bottom of the tide where there's the lowest amount of water, like near the end of that outgoing. I'd say would be the sweet zone.
It's good. Let's talk about, I mentioned it earlier in the podcast about, Tampa Bay in particular. And, we had this event in Ruskin, which is just kind of south of Tampa, but still really kind of part of the whole bay. And it's really close to the Piney Point. And it seems like that whole area just got decimated. The redfish have come back, snook have come back, the trout have not. I personally think it was a mistake for FWC to open up some of these limits as quick as they did. What do you guys think, and what are you guys seeing? I know even White, you live in Texas, but you just came here and fished. What are you guys' thoughts on all that with trout and getting them back, getting that population back?
Yeah, I've lived on Tampa Bay now for 6 years, and this has by far been the least amount of trout that I've seen so far. Granted that now I'm living closer to the Gulf, which is where the red tide issues usually are. So like 4 years ago, we had a bad red tide, and I was in the upper bay. I was kind of near downtown Tampa, and the trout bite was actually really good. Like that was actually some of the best fishing that I had since I lived there, because that red tide pretty much just went halfway up the bay. And I think just fortunately, a lot of fish actually sense red tide and they bolt. They go further inland is my guess, because that was by far the best summer fall I ever had in upper Tampa Bay. But now living close to the Gulf, the trout bite this spring was amazing. Really, the past year and a half, they closed the trout fishery altogether from that really bad one. Trout fishing was amazing my 2 years living here, and it was night and day difference. As soon as that red tide happened, they were gone, and they really haven't come back, at least to this area, which is again closer to the Gulf. Yes, there's some, but I mean it's nowhere even close to what there was before, and it's slowly getting better, of course, and I'm sure it will continually get better. But it's been really sad to see, how much that trout fishery has been impacted. It seems like trout got hit way harder than redfish and snook. Maybe they just went somewhere far away and haven't come back yet, but I really don't know.
Because we had multiple spots, based on the trends that we could go and catch. It seemed like a trout almost every cast. Like they would just be in this time of year, they'd be all like, find one, you find 100 of them, or maybe who knows how many are actually down there in those holes, and they're just not there. Or there's a couple, and they're just not there like they used to be. It's a shame. And I mean, it goes back to that release over 20. We know we're big proponents of that. It pretty much every single trout over 20 inches or 20 and above is a female. The ones are going to be really responsible for the reproducing all the next level, the next series of trout in your area. And, as Dave Fladd and those guys that release over 20 talk about, when you get the real big girls through 27 to 32s, I mean, the real big ones, he uses that analogy about if you have 27 to 30 inch trout reproducing, they're creating other big trout, or at least the opportunity for it. It's the same with really tall people, right? There's some areas that have really short people in the world, and some areas have really tall people. And if you took out all of one type of height of person, you eventually kind of eliminate the opportunity to have a really tall person. And so I would encourage you guys to do that. I saw, this is wild. I don't know if you guys saw this. This is today as we're recording this. Someone just sent me over the article, but Scotland, I believe it was Scotland. They've got a pretty good cod fishery, or at least it has been a pretty good cod fishery, and it's been overfished. They've kind of had way too high limits for both commercial and recreation. And now they just announced for 3 months, like the main river where they catch all the cod, shut down, no boat traffic, like literally shutting it down for 3 months. And the people who are really irate are the commercial guys, because they make a living. So like they literally have lost their jobs for 3 months. But they said, guys, it's so bad. We've overfished this area by literally just maxing out our limit that, yeah, short term, it sucks. You're going to lose your job or not have any income for 3 months. But if we keep going at this pace, by the end of the year, the entire thing's decimated. It's done. And you all lose your jobs forever. You have to go find completely new industries. It's really wild. It was an interesting article. But that kind of stuff can happen anywhere. I mean, who would have thought they'd be shutting down a massive river from like all boat traffic? Just to let a population of one fish, kind of it just survive. Basically, it sounds like it's almost like survival mode. It was a really interesting article, but we'll try to find that and put it in the show notes. Well, what else do you guys think? I know Wyatt, you were close to those guys in the Carolinas and in Texas. They have a bunch of those big citation trout over there. What are you guys' thoughts on catching and releasing and just in general, I think people would say they're not catching as many big trout as they used to everywhere.
Yeah, I would say the biggest things in talking to a lot of big trout guys, it's really, and looking at all the data that Release Over 20's put out, the girls that are 20 and over, they are providing the best genetics to the gene pool. The trout that are actually producing the most eggs are your ones that are, 14 to 17 inches, just because there's more of them. But when you look at how many eggs like a 25 to 27 puts out, it's like insane. It's a couple million. And the genetics of those eggs are, in my opinion, much more valuable than that of the smaller ones. So here in Texas, they even have breeding stock trout they got tanks full of 30-inch trout, and they get those fingerling trout and those small hatchlings, and they release them out. And that's good genetics that's getting put in our bay systems. I think that's something that'd be great for a lot of states to adopt. I don't know the logistics behind it, but it's a fantastic idea. But any angler that's out there that really loves fishing, I think if you catch a trout that's over 20 inches and you think of the impact that fish has, making sure that it gets back safely, it gets revived properly, you are providing an insane amount of fish back to your area. One fish makes a huge difference. So anything over 20, I always put it back. In 2021, we actually had a big movement here in Texas after the freeze. We had Release 2021 Texas, where we put everything back. I didn't keep a single fish back in the entirety after the freeze. Kept some fish in January, but once the freeze hit, I didn't keep anything. Just being aware of what you can do to help your fishery. Just if you enjoy fishing, I think you're probably doing it for more than just the fillet. So think about when you catch a trout, the possibility of what it could give you if you put it back. We look at tagging studies just for redfish alone. There's a redfish in Tampa Bay. They call him the mayor of the redfish mayor of Tampa Bay. He's been caught I think 16, 17 times at this point and counting. And they know because he's got very specific spots on him. They got t-shirts of him. So same thing with trout. You put a trout back and it spawns for 2 more seasons. What are you laughing at, Justin? But it spawns for 2 more seasons, and you've got a couple million more trout that are in your bay system. So I'm a huge proponent of releasing fish, especially trout.
Good.
Fish don't celebrities. All I can think about is doing a selfie with the mayor redfish. Hey, what's up? Like, please just let me know.
Sign my shirt.
I'll add to that, because I think it's super important is the conservation side, especially those big ones. But just know, when handling trout are the most fragile of all of our core target species. With redfish, sea trout, snook, flounder, trout are by far the most sensitive. So make sure to be careful. If you're using live bait, please use circle hooks. And when you're using lures or whatever, please be just feeling for strikes. Have a good rod where you can feel the strike and get a quick hook set. We did a podcast with a scientist. I can't remember his name. He was out of Texas, and they did some detailed studies on trout, on catch and release practices. And they found that they actually literally did like some legit science on it, where they would get towels and wipe off all of their slime, right? Because that's a big thing, of protect their slime. They did that. They tested on gills, like if the fish got hooked deep. And by far, the number one reason why a fish wouldn't survive is if it got hooked deep. It was like a 99% mortality rate if the trout is hooked deep. So make sure to be very mindful of that. Circle hook's number one if you're using live or natural bait. If you're using lures, just make sure to be keeping just contact of your lure, or at least watching your line so you can get a quick hook set. And even just caring for them, right? Don't touch their gills at all. If their gills get compromised, they're pretty much toast. So just want to be very, very careful of that. And like even holding for pictures, right? Like although you can, physically you can slide your hands up in the gill plate. Please don't do that. That can make significant damage if your finger is barely off. So grab it with two hands, hold it, quick pick, back in the water and back in action.
Good. Guys, anything else on this?
I think we've covered winter trout as much as we can.
Excellent. Now, if we could just get Justin to end it by singing Paula Cole's "Where Have All the Cowboys Gone?" I know it's your favorite.
A little bit hoarse from this weekend. I'm gonna.
I'll say one more. I have to imagine somebody's wondering is, hey, like, what about live bait? Right? Like we talked about lures, and what about live bait? And my personal thought is, given how the trout that we talked about, they're going to be in pockets, right? They're not going to be like summertime where they're all spread out. They're going to be in pockets, and so a lot of it's covering ground and finding those pockets. And I think lures are way better than live bait in the wintertime, because you can fish faster and find those pockets of fish better. Because if you're with live bait, if you have live shrimp and you're just fishing one, you really have to go super slow with live bait, and the odds of getting one of those pockets is just going to be smaller. So I found personally that my wintertime catch rate of trout skyrocketed once I totally went away from live bait and just focused on lures and just focused on the types of spots that we've been talking about and the types of lures we've been talking about. And so now I literally don't even mess with live bait during the wintertime.
I got no time for that. Cool, guys. Was very, very helpful. And if you guys want to see on the water fishing tips every single day, Monday through Friday, we literally go fish new spots every single day now, literally 5 days out of the 7. And we post it. We post everything, the pre-trip plan. So exactly how we're finding the spots, most importantly, why we think those spots are going to be good, and then going and fishing them and then reporting back to you, our insider members, what happened, where the fish were caught, where they were missed, what mistakes were made, because you can learn so much from that. And we put that in the form of kind of a post-trip analysis. So 3 videos every single day on a brand new spot, from Texas to, up to Virginia. And now we got Pat out there cruising in his RV, going to fish new spots with new members. And you guys are doing a good job about now, including, insider members. So if you guys want some of that, it's the best way to learn. I mean, we could sit here and podcast and talk about this stuff all day long, but a lot of you can't visualize it, right? Some of you guys here at Oyster Bar, and you think Tampa Bay Oyster Bar, like way up there, you can't even get to it in a boat. And some of you think, what Wyatt's talking about, because I like that one in Boca Grande, Luke. I mean, it's crazy deep. I mean, it might be 15 feet right next to that Oyster Bar. And so it's a whole lot different to see someone actually fish these type of areas. And it's one of the most valuable things. Obviously, a lot of people come in because of the big savings, the 20 or 30% off all the tackle. Some love the community and just the private tips that we do, the stuff that we don't put out there on the YouTube. But I think for the most part, people, say they love, in terms of helping them find the fish, they love those on the water reports. So if you want some of that, come join us. The only club out there that guarantees your success. So you will find more fish and catch more fish and save money in your tackle and meet some cool friends in the community, or you don't pay. It's that simple. Justin, don't you wish every company treated you like that? We'll give you your money back, even at day 300, if you said you didn't enjoy it. Do you have any companies you do business with that do that?
Nothing, not off the top of my head. I'm making a jingle in my head right now, so if I'm quiet, I'm just like trying to make a song for this. Like,
I'm dying to hear it.
Don't you wish your fishing club was cool like us? It sounds really bad. It's raw. This is a work in progress, but now I'll fine tune it later.
Don't quit your day job.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Back and put your little headset on and listen to Paula Cole, and followed by Sarah McLaughlin and Natalie and Bruglia. I'm trying to think.
You're getting pretty obscure out there now.
Yeah. All right, guys, we'll end it on there, but definitely join us if you haven't already. saltstrong.com. Insider Club, you'll see a button there to join us, and the 27,000 plus other members. And we do some live events too now. We just got done with that one that we kind of talked about here, and man, that was fun. 350 or so people showed up, maybe even 400. It was madness, and gave away a lot of cool stuff. Gave away some rods and reels and sunglasses, and had some breakout sessions. It was really, really cool. So we appreciate all of those who were able to make it. We will be doing more. Otherwise, we'll talk to you in the next episode. Peace. We out. Whoop, whoop.
'Cause fishing, it's in my soul. It was passed down to me from the days of old. Find us on the water if there was a way. It's been said my papa, he wrote the book on catching big reds and 20-pound snook. I wish I knew all the things he knew today. For he's the reason why we are this way. And he put fishing in our souls to stay.